in Morocco, Sudan, and Ethiopia. Today, Humanity First is proud to host our dear friend, Dr. Hugo Slim, who is no stranger to the humanitarian community, having served for over years across the world, including in Morocco, Sudan, Ethiopia. He is an academic and policy editor in international relations, specializing in the ethics of war and humanitarian aid. His most recent work has been at the ICRC in Geneva, where he has been head and humanitarian diplomacy. He is due to start back at Oxford University in June as a senior research fellow at the Institute of Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. He writes regularly all matters ethical, and his most recent book is Humanitarian Ethics, the Morality of Aid in War and Disasters, which is being published, which was by Hurst and Oxford University Press in 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Hugo Slim.
Jonathan, thank you very much, and thank you for such a warm welcome, and thank you to Dr. Aziz Hafiz and others at Humanity First for inviting me today. It's a really great pleasure to speak in a Humanity First event. Britain is blessed with many wonderful organizations inspired by Islam, and many thousands of Muslims are working as key workers at the front lines across the UK and across the world in the COVID pandemic. Humanity First, which started nearly 30 years ago in the Balkans, is now in 52 countries. And many of their volunteers in the UK today that I'm aware of are working on food banks and also doing a 24/7 mental health and emotional support helpline for people. So like billions of people across the world today, working in organizations or simply working to help people as good neighbors, these volunteers are living the positive spirit of COVID ethics, which are really, COVID ethics are really just a new manifestation of timeless humanitarian ethics, or just more simply, human ethics. So today, in the next 25 minutes, I would like to talk to you about four things. First of all, just very briefly, I'll look at what we mean by ethics. Then secondly, I'll look at what is distinct about COVID ethics. And then thirdly, what is ethically important for humanitarian organizations in this COVID moment. And then finally, largely because Dr. Aziz asked me to, I'm going to talk about what is ethically important for us as individuals in this crisis. So if we start, what do we mean by ethics? And it's quite simple, really. We all know what we mean by ethics. Ethics comes from the Greek word ethos, which means character. So when we do ethics, we make judgments about the character, the human character, and the character of human actions. We ask simply, what is good or bad in the character of a person, an organization, or a policy? And we ask what is right or wrong in the actions of a person or an organization. And in the COVID crisis, I think we should be asking what are the good things to keep hold of in this emergency? And what are the best things to do in this emergency? So that's where we need to be thinking. And I will now just look at my second point, which is what is distinct about COVID ethics. I think we can say that the COVID pandemic is ethically distinct for three reasons. First, it's a truly global emergency because it touches us all and has the potential to hurt us all, every person in the world. It puts the global population at risk, either from immediate disease and death or from lockdown policies designed to reduce transmission, or from the deep economic, social, and political changes that are resulting from lockdowns. It would not, of course, be true to say that COVID is unique because it is a global emergency. We would be right to say that poverty is a permanent global emergency. So is endemic human violence a permanent global emergency, and of course, climate change. And in many ways, these are equally serious global emergencies, actually with often higher death rates so far. However, these deeply structural and permanent emergencies are not felt the same way by everybody. The COVID pandemic at the moment has a distinctly global feel that touches everyone as a direct harm or acquaintance with somebody who's been harmed, or the fear and dread of harm. So it has a global feel, which makes it ethically experienced by everyone and different. The second thing is that the COVID pandemic is having a major social and economic impact on all states. All states, rich and poor, are being weakened by the COVID crisis. The disease and the response to the disease is deeply damaging all economies. Even states that seem to be managing the health dimension and reducing transmission very well, like Korea, Germany, and Turkey, will suffer economically from a collapse in demand and spending power from markets all around the world. So being good at the health component doesn't protect you from the wider economic challenge that your society will become poorer in the short term because of lockdowns and industry collapse around the world. Thirdly, I think the universalism of this emergency that I've just described makes it a world-changing moment in human history. Here, at last, we see the potential for something ethically positive emerging in the COVID emergency. It is, I think, a massive universal catalyst for change. It's not an emergency which can run on quietly while most of us continue our normal lives, like, sadly, poverty, creeping climate change, and local wars around the world, to which many of us are numb most of the time. It's changing the way each one of us lives, loves, works, trades, and plays, and it will continue to do so. In this way, I think COVID is ethically distinct because it gives us that rare moment to see and make a brave new world. And this, of course, is the phrase that Shakespeare puts into the mouth of Miranda, whose name means one who wonders at things, in his play The Tempest, when she sees other human beings for the first time and has a glimpse of a new world beyond her deserted island. And she says, "Oh wonder, how many goodly creatures are there here, how beauteous mankind is. Oh brave new world that has such people in it." And I think COVID is a brave new world moment for all states and all people. It offers a great opportunity, an ethical opportunity, to embrace universal cooperation in a new shared vision of the world. Like the end of a war or the fall of an empire, the COVID crisis gives us all the chance to see each other anew, as if for the first time, and invent a better world. And it feels as if this is happening in many places across the world as people recognize they are in the same boat, that their lives are precious, and that they want to help each other. This is certainly not the feeling of all our political leaders or all people in the world, but it is a feeling in billions of people at this moment. So in a way, COVID has sparked a new moral consciousness of humanity as one. Ethically, this makes the COVID crisis a pivotal moment to affirm new good things and to avoid bad things as we are forced and required to make a new world. Our time becomes a universal moment of ethical decision. What will be the character of our new world? Will we take the plunge to build a fairer, greener, more cooperative world from the damage of COVID? And will we maximize and exploit the amazing human innovations that we are making so fast every day to overcome COVID? And will we share those innovations? So in short, will we be ethically brave as we wonder at, encounter, and shape a new world? Or will we retreat to our respective islands and let the moment pass? That, I think, to me, is the big ethical question at the global level, for our world, for our politicians, for people. So if that's some global things that make the COVID pandemic ethically distinct, what is ethically important for humanitarians in the COVID crisis? I think humanitarian organizations should be focusing hard on three things. The first is obvious. We should be working hard to fulfill our fundamental mission as encapsulated in the core values of humanity and impartiality. This means you as humanitarians must, above all, be working to protect life and health and ensure respect for the human being. And you should be doing this impartially, which means helping everyone everywhere on the basis of their needs and making no discrimination, no negative discrimination about people's politics, their class, their race, their religion, or their group. This is our fundamental mission as humanitarians, and that we must hold in the COVID pandemic. But around impartiality, I would encourage you especially to think carefully about two things. Two patterns of bias that we could creep into in our COVID response. People are not suffering in the world today only because of COVID. They still have heart disease, malaria, cancer, and malnutrition. So we need to be careful not to go, if you like, COVID crazy in our health programming and skew all our work to this one disease and the fears around this disease. Healthcare parity is really important so that your programs have a balanced portfolio of resources and services towards not just COVID, but other forms of illness and ill health. This means focusing on equity in healthcare systems that integrate COVID alongside many other killer diseases that are still altogether killing more people than COVID. If we are excessively biased towards COVID-19, then we are unfair and not impartial. And taking the COVID opportunity means building stronger health systems for all sick people and for the prevention of all infectious diseases. So it means we must be building health systems, not just COVID systems. The second thing about impartiality we have to be careful is finding the right balance between health and jobs, lives and livelihoods. The crisis can make people ill and die because the disease can hurt us and kill us. But it can also, the crisis, the wider crisis of lockdown, economic collapse, can make people poor and hungry, and so more likely to die in other ways. This makes it essential that people's needs are not simplistically stereotyped as medical needs and health needs. Humanitarian organizations must respond impartially in a way that tries to protect all essential human needs. And we need, therefore, to have economic programs and livelihood programs that are really real and significant for people. But we also need to take special care to look carefully at who is suffering the worst in a COVID crisis. And we need to design our programs towards them. Which groups are sickest? Which people are becoming poorest? Which groups are becoming dangerously invisible? If we're to be impartial, we have to focus on these questions. We're already learning that some people are more at risk than others, like older people, people with underlying conditions, and minority groups living in poorer conditions with lower health profiles. And we must find ways to shield people that do not also imprison them beyond society. We have to keep shielded people connected somehow. So that's important issues about impartiality, but there's one more, which I hope will come to us soon. Finally, when the vaccine or the cure arrives, impartiality demands universal coverage, and we must all struggle hard for this with governments and businesses everywhere. So that's impartiality obligations. I think the second big ethical obligation on humanitarian organizations is around the principles of voluntary action and unity. We have to use the COVID moment to come together and work more fairly and equally together as the humanitarian sector. This means showing much greater respect for humanitarian volunteers who are a humanitarian necessity in this crisis too. COVID's seen a massive rise in mutual aid between people, down my street, down your street, everybody coming together all over the world to help each other voluntarily. And this crisis has also seen new patterns of social distancing, which mean that international organizations cannot intervene directly in the same way. So we need local organizations, we need volunteers. And they must be given the space they need to become sustainable local humanitarian systems that are fit for their own cultures and their own societies. And humanitarian bureaucrats in the big international and Western organizations who can become rather rich in these Western-funded organizations should at the same time lose some of their perks and show a deeper sense of voluntary action themselves. That too would be ethical. So here it seems to me that Humanity First's profound commitment to voluntarism and volunteering actually is an important model for the sector at the moment, in several important ways, I think. The next question around humanitarian organizations, I think, is this one of unity. The principle of humanitarian unity must also be championed and lived in practice much more. We cannot speak of humanitarian unity across the world if some organizations, big, largely Western or big, even Islamic organizations, work as first-class humanitarians and impose a subordinate position on national and local organizations as some kind of second-class humanitarian citizens. To make this change, we have to do away with colonial attitudes of collaboration and work much more in real partnerships of equals between local and international organizations in the global response. And the COVID crisis, I think, gives us a momentous opportunity, an ethical opportunity, to democratize the humanitarian system so that it ends humanitarian hierarchies that are a relic of empire and lives the principle of humanity by fully respecting all human beings who are engaged in humanitarian action. The third big thing for humanitarian organizations at this time, and it is an ethical imperative, is to really use the COVID crisis to innovate. New ways of being an organization and new ways of working. And it's very exciting how certain new forms of human activity and relationships are being accelerated by the crisis. Most obviously remote working and remote surveillance, remote relationships, different ways of being humanly present to one another. As I'm doing now, I'm new, as you can see. I'm new to webinars like this, and I still can't quite get the right part of my glasses engaged in the screen and the camera and the paper at the same time. But we are all learning to innovate and to be present to one another in new ways. And this is incredibly important. These new ways of working will never replace embodied human presence with one another. And they'll not replace the way we learn and understand about each other face to face, but they are fit for purpose for many things, and we will benefit greatly as a humanitarian sector from developing different ways of meeting, being together, knowing one another, and knowing about one another from these technologies. But all these new technologies must be ethically monitored, understood, and adapted, so they are really positive in their application and not negative developments in humanitarian action. I think the other last change that will require innovation is that after a period of relative luxury and enormous economic growth in the humanitarian sector, the COVID emergency will force us to learn how to do more with less in many areas of our work. And this is always a very demanding, but ultimately creative thing, to learn to do more with less. Necessity will be the mother of many inventions in organizational structure, staffing, and programming in what follows with the COVID emergency. These are good things if they respect human beings and enable us to be more humanitarian and better humanitarian organizations. So that, I think, is my point, my third point about what is important, ethically important for humanitarian organizations to do at the moment. And it's around impartiality, voluntary action, unity, and innovation. So my final set of thoughts is what is ethically important for us as individuals in this crisis. I've thought about the world and I've thought about human organizations. Now I'll try and put down some thoughts about us as individuals, in our own homes, in our own families, in our own communities. The universalism of the COVID crisis means we are all potentially affected by its health and economic impact, and by the new ways of living it demands from us at the moment. This means that for the majority of people, our work-life balance is becoming more complicated and more ethically challenging. How can we work as hard for a humanitarian organization if we are now shielding a family member or homeschooling our children? Will we be good volunteers if last week we were made redundant, lost our jobs, and are deeply worried about our future? How much should we be volunteering and how much should we be job hunting? What does it also mean that each one of us is now a potential carrier of COVID, so that our carelessness around transmission could harm someone? We all have serious new, what we might call disease duties as we move around. We have to take these disease duties seriously, and they change the way we live. The COVID crisis means many of us are having to recalculate our personal ethics and reassess where our priorities lie. And this is the right thing to do. We have a range of duties as human beings. We must balance them well and decide what is right. And we need to discuss these changes with our organizations and our families so that we can agree the best possible solution for everyone. We're all adapting to this new world, and we're all continuing to adapt, and we will do. And we need to cooperate as families and organizations together as we adapt. How to be good, of course, and do good in the COVID crisis is a new experience for many of us in the rich world, where I'm speaking from. But people in the poor world of permanent poverty, permanent war, and permanent disasters are expert here, and have been juggling conflicting duties in extreme situations for centuries and decades. And we can learn a lot about survival and adaptation from the moral wisdom of people who we're usually trying to help. So we can learn from them. And finally, our other big duty as citizens, wherever we are, is to keep an eye on our governments and on the leaders of our organizations. as they manage this crisis above us. There is a duty on us all to take an active interest in how policy choices and political decisions affect the rights of others and ourselves, where we live and throughout the world. We need to insist that our leaders tell us what they are thinking and how they are deciding things. In this process, we should accept that it's truthful and legitimate if some of our political leaders or leaders in our organizations say to us sometimes, I don't know what the answer to that question is. We're not sure about this problem, this challenge, as well as, I think we should try this now. Let's try it even if we're not sure. And if our leaders are being transparent, as they have a duty to be in these emergencies, and are discussing these choices across their organizations and across their society, then that's a good thing. It's a good thing morally, but it's a good thing because it's the most politically effective way of keeping people together in a response for the common good. But if our politicians and our humanitarian leaders are not doing their duty in this emergency, and they're not being honest and discussing and deliberating with us, then it's a problem. And then I think if we find that they are being unjustifiably deceitful, negligent, or even tyrannical, then we ethically must, question and challenge them for the common good. So I'll stop here. My time's nearly up, and I'll just have a final thought and bring us back to Islam. In the Quran, Allah and his Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, often call us to follow the straight path. But I was interested to see that in one surah towards the end of the Quran, he also urges us to attempt the steep path. And our journey through the COVID crisis will, I think, be a steep path for us, for our families, for the world, for the businesses and organizations we are in. But we must struggle up this steep path. And as we do, we must be comforted by the words of another surah, another small surah, of course, at the end of the Quran, which says that where there is hardship, there is also relief. And it's our job as humanitarians to bring that relief in hardship. And it's our experience as humans to enjoy that relief when we feel it in the steep path as we climb it. So I'll stop, and I hope I've given some thoughts, some ethical points around the COVID emergency, which help and which we can discuss. Thank you.
Very much, Dr. Slim, for
I knew we'd get that virtual tea eventually.
I hope so.
Can I thank you on behalf of all the listeners, the viewers, Humanity First, humanitarians across the world, for a really, really enlightening talk. Now, I won't speak too long because the questions are piling in thick and fast. So I think let me just jump to them, if that's okay. Give you a bit of a breather. So the first question we've got in is from the UK, and I'll read it out. Bear with me, I'm just literally reading them live as well. Is the humanitarian principle of impartiality still relevant in today's world when access to aid, including medical attention required to alleviate COVID, are blocked by armed groups seeking to demoralize and hurt communities under their control? Sorry, I hope I've read that clearly.
Yeah. Do you want to do one at a time?
Yes, yes. Should we do one at a time?
Okay, do another one.
Okay, so the next one, again, from the United Kingdom. How can humanitarian agencies with annualized funding cycles and donor demand ensure that their work against COVID-19 is not only effective, but also ethical? Or in your words, effective?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. On the point about impartiality, I feel that question quite rightly comes from a terrible sense of injustice and frustration that armed groups, and it's not just armed groups, there are many states in conflicts as well who also prevent access to humanitarian aid. So warring parties often deliberately block and obstruct. And this is terrible, and we have to climb the steep path about it. We have to keep organizing, keep trying to find a way in, trying to negotiate, trying to change their policies. But you're absolutely right in your basic question that it becomes impossible for us to be really, truly impartial and meet the most needy if we are stopped at checkpoints, airports, harbors, and blocked. But ethically, the responsibility for that lies on those who stop humanitarian aid, not those who are trying to deliver humanitarian aid. So those people, those warring parties who stop humanitarian aid for unacceptable reasons, are responsible. On annual funding and effectiveness, I know this is a long problem in the humanitarian sector that we always feel we're not really able to plan and invest in long-term programs because we only have sort of fixed money for a year at a time. And at the moment in the COVID crisis, the uncertainty of future financing is even more extreme. Some charities are going to go broke. They are going broke already and into bankruptcy. We will lose, the sector will change dramatically. So I think that's all the more reason that wherever possible, the big donor governments, the big Islamic charities around the world can all come together and at least commit to multi-year financing to say, we want to sustain these health systems, we want to invest in businesses and the economy to revive people's livelihoods. And it would be great if they could commit money and a sort of plan for more than a year, for 2 to 3 years at a time. And then I think it would make the job of agencies easier. So I think that's a really important point.
Thanks, Hugo. We have next I have in front of me is how can post-conflict stabilization efforts be improved? From a questioner. How can post-conflict stabilization efforts be improved?
Right. Well, this is all about peacekeeping and peace operations and investment in health and basic services for people who are hopefully emerging out of conflict. And I think, I'm going to be really honest now because I'm speaking as myself now after 5 years with the ICRC and not with a party line. I think you can go on tinkering, trying to make this strange, intervening UN, highly politicized approach to stabilization. You can keep trying to tweak it and making it work because it works better with local NGOs or because it's got a better mandate or because the troops are better trained or whatever. And the investment arrives more quickly. But in truth, I think stabilization is always going to be unstable, and I think it'll always be erratic and volatile, and it's not peace. And the only real way to improve and get beyond stabilization and unstabilization is to find ways for people to come together and make that political solution. And I think my experience over the last few years, I think after the Cold War, you could have elite deals where people were pushed around the table by all states, because all states, Russia, China, the US, all the big powers were working together. You could make people make peace. But now, actually, it's not like that. The powers are contesting each other. They're on different sides of a war. I think the only constituency that can genuinely make real peace in the world today is the people themselves. And when I teach peacemaking and things like that, I always show this amazing film from Liberia called Pray the Devil Back to Hell, about the women's peace movement in Liberia, which rose up with Christians, Muslims, secular women, and took to the streets and became powerful to bring the war to an end. And I'm afraid I think that in this globally contested age, unless we start seeing terrible wars which fight and destroy to the end, people must make peace. They must make stability.
Hugo, I'm trying to keep track with all the questions coming from the chat. I'm going to sneak in a question from myself, if that's okay. You mentioned whilst you were talking about a sort of a changing order within the humanitarian community, and this view of we as NGOs know it all coming down, and you said maybe it's time to lose some of those perks. From an ethical point of view, I can see where you're coming from, but NGOs also have staff members, and those staff are employed, and there are then perks that are perks in inverted commas that are attached to that. How do we define that balance between what is seen in the outside world as perks, and then the balance on an individual level as an individual worker employee for that organization? I hope I've realized that well.
Yeah, it's a really important point, and I think what I'm saying, you're right. We're going to have to find a middle way. We're going to find a way that is a moderate way of being paid, looked after, rewarded as an international humanitarian aid worker and as a national humanitarian worker. And we have to find the right balance. But I think the calculations will change in the COVID emergency. There'll be less money, and if there is more money going into aid, it'll be really more scrutinized yet again, and I think that's important. I think we know a perk when we see one. I think when we, I've lived, the last few years in the sort of elite side of, international aid work, and I think we know when someone's flying business class and probably don't really need to at all. I think we know when the hotel they're staying in for a sense of their own status, much more than actually staying in it because it's a good hotel and close to whatever. They should perhaps stay in a slightly cheaper one. I think, you and I would recognize, and I think most people would recognize, when a perk is not something sensible and just and fair for people working incredibly hard, but is a bit over the top and not what we should be doing anymore when most people doing humanitarian work are volunteering.
And on the back of that, another question. Forgive me, I'm reading them on the chat. With reference to the grand bargain and localization, clearly for the last number of years, this has really been a mantra about giving power and autonomy on the local level. How do you feel that will now pan out in the new normal, for want of another word?
Well, I still think the basic premise will be there, that in a global response, when a society is overwhelmed, people in that society will need a combination of international and local support. The definition of being overwhelmed means you haven't got everything you need, and you need help. So we'll need international and local combinations of humanitarian action. But I think the great thing about the COVID pandemic could be that internationals have to step back much more, and they must let local actors lead and national actors lead. They must honestly invest national and local institutions more than their own institutions on the ground. And they must really work to create sustainable people who work there. And I think, after 2 years of this, we'll realize that actually we don't have to be on the ground everywhere if we're an international organization. We can work genuinely in a different kind of partnership with people in national and local organizations who can lead much more. And we can, what I and others always say, decolonize the basic structure of the Western humanitarian system. But I think the Islamic system is probably pretty patriarchal at times too, and very dominated by the people with money and stuff. So we need to step back from that, and as I said, make more equal partnerships. And I think COVID will have forced that upon some organizations in the system.
I'll quickly go on to, we've got a question from the Congo, what is your view on, again, I'm only asking the question. So it's a question from a gentleman in the Congo, I suspect humanitarian worker. What is your view on the performance of the WHO in this crisis? In the DR Congo, the government imposed lockdown without any assistance. Is that ethical?
So I'm sure that's a great question. I don't know enough about the performance of the WHO globally or in DRC, in Congo, if it's that Congo. My impression is that we're lucky to have the WHO. We're very lucky to have formed this organization, decades ago after the First World War and in its first manifestation, and then after that, the Second World War. We need it. We need some organization with a global view on health crisis and health policy. But whenever you judge the performance of a UN organization, you have to realize that you're judging the performance of an organization that is governed and organized by member states. So you can't always blame the organization itself because it is being guided and it's responsible to the member states of the UN. So it's not allowed to boss countries around. It's not allowed to go in and take control over a country's policies. It is largely there to advise on policy, to work with the government on its own initiatives, the government initiatives, and to resource those when there are gaps, and to advise countries on what it knows about the spread of disease around other parts of the world. I think it's done that very well, actually. And I think it's always difficult dealing with big powers to remain independent totally from them, to not be swayed by power. And if, like Spanish flu, this pandemic had started in America, in the US, like Spanish flu 100 years ago started in the US, in Kansas, I think the WHO might have had a bit of trouble dealing with the US as well, if it was the source of a major pandemic. So I think it's hard to blame them for not governments around.
I think I might have lost. Talking about the US, next question is from the US. It's from one of our Humanity First colleagues. What are the different ways of holding local and national actors to account? What metrics and what are the means of enforcement?
So this is a really important question because I've talked about, what others might describe as sort of slightly corrupt elements of the Western system, too much money, too many staff, too many perks, etc. But of course, there is, you can easily have an interpretation of corruption in local and national organizations as well, and that corruption can be political and financial. So obviously, you have to make an agreement with a partner and have very clear agreements about what your objectives are, and how you're going to work, and how you're going to use your resources and your money. And you must have agreements about transparency and auditing and all these things that you would expect. These are ethical checks and balances on a relationship when you are sharing resources. That has to happen. And enforcement you have to have in the terms of your contract or whatever. And you have to be ready to have whistleblowers and speak out. And you have to be ready to walk away sometimes. In a crisis and leave an organization, which is obviously what President Trump thinks he is rightly doing with the World Health Organization, although I think I would agree, like many others, that he's not right to do it at the moment. So I think, you have to set the goals and be real and be open and develop a lot of trust and be ready to walk away if the partner is not ethical.
Thank you. And I'll go straight to the next question. I believe is from Bangladesh. How do we prioritize humanitarian crises happening simultaneously in different parts of the world? Example, the priority is COVID-19. What about hunger and malnutrition in the poorer countries of the world? I think you might have answered that already in your talk. But
well, I tried to answer it, but I can never answer it because your questioner is right. These challenges of prioritization are really painful, and they are always painful because we never have enough to do everything. We haven't cured poverty, we haven't cured hunger, we haven't resolved all these things, and then now COVID has come on top of all these other things for many people. So the terrible answer is I think we'll never get the priority setting absolutely right, people will always suffer beyond our priority setting and our reach. I think we just have to make very clear that we as an organization realize where we can have the most impact because of our strengths, because of our weaknesses, because of our expertise, because of our network. And then we must commit to going and working where we can have maximum benefit. And when we do that, we have to mitigate the worst effects of our actions. Where we don't go, what we don't do, we have to encourage others to do it, or we have to draw attention to those needs. And wherever possible, we should work together in what, international relations and others call collective action, so that we make the most of what everybody's got together, and don't, divide the sum of what we have. So there are some basic rules. Go where you're going to be best, where you're best placed to do a really good job. Go where the needs are clear. And the needs you can't meet, you must call attention to them for other people to try and resource.
Oh, Hugo, thank you so much. They're still coming in thick and fast. I hope you're okay for me to continue for a little bit longer.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I've got next is, sorry, I don't know from which part or continent of the world this is. Apologies. As many governments have co-opted humanitarianism, would it be more effective and ethical to remove issues of competition within the aid system at the time of a pandemic by those donor nations to becoming a centralized coordinator of aid efforts?
Again, I think you need to, I know the temptation is surely if we just had one great power in charge, then it would all be good. I'm a sort of Western liberal pluralist, so I tend to think actually there's a lot of good things in diversity and competition, as well as in organization and coordination and collective action. So I wouldn't want a totally top-down hierarchy, because then you're very vulnerable to dictators, to bad policies being driven across a whole system. You're very vulnerable not to have any space for new policies and ideas to be innovated, to be tested, to be piloted. You get groupthink, dogma in a big system like that. So I would agree with your questioner that we need to find ways to work better together. Our collective action has to be better organized. We probably do need in each place good, charismatic people that are driving a response. But we don't want a monist response of just one organization, one dictator, because if they get it badly wrong, they get everything wrong. And so, I'm a liberal. I think you need diversity and competition and different ideas and options. And that's the balance you have to strike there. And it's always a bit messy, but it's better messy, I think.
Thank you very much, Hugo. I'm conscious we've gone over time. I will sneak the last question in if I can. So the question is, what does accountability look like in the context of COVID-19?
Well, that's a great question. Accountability has to be determined by the objectives you set yourself. So I think accountability in COVID-19, and this is off the top of my head, but it's rather an interesting question for a paper, actually. We have to find ways of reducing transmission without totally bankrupting individuals and the whole world. So we have to be accountable for getting the balance right between life and livelihoods, between health and economy. Because without economy, we don't have health anyway. And vice versa. So we have to be accountable in that difficult area of judgment. We have to be accountable about coverage and reach and impartiality. So we have to show that we have really made efforts to go and find where people are really in need, and not just gone where it's easiest, closest, simplest, or whatever. So we have to be accountable for really trying impartiality. And we have to be accountable for what I said earlier, not just doing COVID, but actually recognizing that people suffer and die and become poor for many other reasons. And we can't let those go while we become a single issue humanitarian response. That would be wrong. So we must be accountable for keeping a broad, balanced portfolio of meeting human needs, not just COVID needs. That's tricky too. And I think we need to be responsible, as I said in the talk, really, for the way we work together, so that we work respectfully of one another, we work locally and internationally well together, we cooperate, we do not dominate and colonize, but we empower, enable, and set up and support systems at country level of government, of organizations, of volunteers that will go on being a sustainable system. And of course, finally, accountably, we need to find a vaccine and a cure, and that would be a wonderful thing to tick and say, yeah, we can say we achieved that as human society. So those kind of areas, I think, off the top of my head.
Hugo, I think we've come to the end of our allocated time slot. First of all, to you, can I say thank you on behalf of Humanity First, on behalf of all the listeners and all the many that will continue to listen once we have this on YouTube straight after. It has really been, I think, judging by the questions, and it clearly has provoked a lot of thought. And I think you'd probably agree with me that I've personally been quite impressed with the range of questions, and we have got them from around the world. Can I just say before we conclude, other than a huge thank you to Hugo, as you've heard, he's in the middle of, in between jobs at the moment. Thank you for coming on. I know he's in very, very high demand, but the subject matter is so pertinent, not only for us as humanitarians, but I think I would say for us as human beings, for us as humanity across the world, the subject matter is so pertinent. So thank you once again. You can watch this again on Humanity First, hfuk.org. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will hear about forthcoming webinars that we've got coming up. We're looking forward to a number of key speakers. We hope to have Professor Jeremy Howick, also from Oxford, to speak about COVID and mindfulness in the end of June. We're also looking forward to have Atif Mia from Princeton in terms of the economics of COVID-19 and the impact on the global economy. Keep up to date on our website. You will see a list of those webinars and when they are. With that, I will conclude. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Hugo, and thank you and goodbye.